Hi, Dr. Wright again. Let's
Hi.
continue with some more questions. In your summary you wrote for my students, you said that you did a study of linguistic profiling in the housing market. First, can you explain what linguistic profiling means and whether this is the same as racial-based linguistic discrimination? And second, can you tell us what did you find in your study?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. Okay, so linguistic profiling is essentially a specific type or one specific act of linguistic discrimination.
Okay.
So racial profiling, um, like profiling as like an action, right, is noticing something about a person, their race, which can be read visually off the body, and then behaving in some discriminatory way. The racial profiling comes out of this literature and history in the United States, at least, with interactions of Black people and police, particularly in New York City, being stopped and frisked by the cops, right? So Black people would just be stopped on the street,
Mm.
pushed up against a wall, and then like patted down to see if they were carrying drugs or knives or whatever. That's profiling because those people were just walking along, doing whatever, not committing a crime. And just because they were in Black skin, they got accosted like they were criminals,
Mm.
right? Okay. So translate that into a linguistic context. Your Blackness isn't read off your skin. It's translated out of your language use. So that happens either in how people hear you or how they read what you produce. So it's not always even necessarily non-standard features, right? Your language might be perfectly standard. It might be perfectly standard in the way it comes out of your mouth. It might be perfectly standard in the way it looks on the page, but your language might just be racialized in the way that your name looks. So your name might be like Deshaun Johnson, and that says I'm a Black man when you read it in the US context, or to many readers, or to many businesses, or to many jobs, if that name is at the top of a resume. And so there's a classic study, not my own, right, that precedes mine, that had identical resumes, hundreds, sent out all over the United States and now the world, with just the names changed, just racially encoded names or so-called not white index names. And they showed that these exact people, these identical resumes, the ones that were white encoded were given jobs or interviews, and the ones that weren't.
Mm.
That's linguistic profiling. That's racial profiling. In my study, I show very similar patterns. I use 3 different dialects that are all my own. I'm a multi-dialectal speaker. I'm from the American South. I'm also a mixed race individual. I'm Black and white. And so I speak African American English, as well as the Southern dialect of the United States, which is where I'm from, and Standard American English. So I used those 3 varieties in a study, calling 90 landlords to find out who would get an appointment, which one of my 3 voices.
Mm.
And I find that not all of them get appointments in the same areas from the same landlords. Those patterns of discrimination also fall on a map of the city I was studying, along the lines of previous of segregation. So housing segregation in the United States, there were neighborhoods where Black people could live and neighborhoods where they couldn't live. Once segregation became illegal, it was enforced through policies, so through informalized and formalized policies at the local and federal levels in the United States for about 100 years. Those policies can be known as things like redlining, and have to do with like home loans and banks where Black people couldn't go and they couldn't get loans. So the patterns of discrimination that are happening right now that have to do with how people interact on the phone and over email enforce these traditional patterns of segregation and housing discrimination that existed previously.
I see. So I understand that you specialize, as you describe, in the American context. But are you aware about how linguistic profiling may impact new immigrants in a country like Japan? Have you ever heard anything about this?
So I have some, maybe not necessarily Japan specifically, but certainly new immigrants in most societies experience some type of linguistic discrimination, or at least struggle linguistically when integrating into a new society or culture if they don't possess the first language of that society or culture. We see the same patterns of linguistic discrimination and linguistic profiling in all across the globe. I mean, especially in the global north. So when we look at, all of Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean, and all of these other globalized societies in China and in India and also in Central and South America, right? In all of these areas, we have hierarchical social structure. And because we have hierarchical social structure and globalized communication and industry, standard language is part of that. Languages of wider communication are part of all of those industries. And so a default towards a standard, it doesn't necessarily have to be English, is part of the way those countries do business. And so as people move in between them, right, cycles of migration and emigration, people are encouraged to use those languages of wider communication when they move. So their home dialects, their home languages, that sound like their regions, that sound like their families, their grandparents, right? Those languages don't get used very often when they move into their new spaces. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're being actively discriminated against, experiencing like hate when they walk out of their doors every day, although some are. But they're encouraged because of this wider usage of normal language to not use their own, right? And to learn English or German or Japanese or modern standard Mandarin instead of the Beijing dialect, right? And so in these instances, there are patterns. There are patterns that are replicable across all of these societies, and it's like 3 generations. So the first generation of immigrants most of the time, sometimes don't know the language of the place they're coming to. They show up, they don't know the language, they maybe don't learn it. They have children, or they brought children with them, and their children learn English or German or whatever, and they never learn Japanese or Cantonese or Arabic or the language of their grandparents. This second generation does a lot of translating for their parents. They're semi-bilingual, right? And then in the third generation, something happens. Their children either become heritage speakers, that they want a connection back to their culture, or they completely lose it. They become fully integrated into the new mainstream culture that they're part of. They're Americans now, they're Germans now, they're Brits. They're no longer immigrants in this third generation, and they don't have a connection with that previous linguistic culture, or they're trying to reestablish it. This isn't the story for everyone. It's just a pattern we've been able to track over centuries of immigration across the globe. So in Japan isn't immune, right?
So you expect that integration probably be easier for second or third generation, right?
It depends.
Third
It really does, because it has a lot to do with how that country feels about those group of people at that given point in time. So one way we can see that is in the United States. The United States really changed the way it felt about Asian immigrants a lot. It went back and forth about the ways in which it felt about Asian immigrants in the United States legally at the federal level and policy. It said, please come here, build our railroads, wash our clothes. And then it said, just kidding, we hate you, go away. We only want so many, we'll make a quota. Right. And then it was like, please run our universities or fill our hospitals, right? I mean, so this is the thing, is like our policies of open door, closed door immigration with Asian immigrant populations as a whole, with a capital A, no distinction, right, have changed the ways in which those groups of people have distinguished themselves from each other linguistically in our country over the last 300 years, or assimilated towards English over the generations of people who have come and stayed here in the United States. And so those things are absolutely true in other countries. Is it safe for you to sound like where you're from? That really has a lot to do with whether the current generation of people who identifies with that group, that immigrant group, is actively producing or seeking to produce that language, and their connection, with the national ideals at an individual level of the country they're in.
Thank you. You're discussing a lot of history. Maybe I would just one last question, maybe. So I understand this a little different topic. So I understand that being able to speak your own language, like especially as an immigrant and maybe a second or third generation of immigrant, you want to speak your ancestors' language, can be important for one's identity, self-identity. But are there any benefits of preserving or even increasing linguistic diversity in a society, for example, like Japan, which doesn't have that much diversity at this point, right?
I think so. I'm, of course, always going to advocate for an increase in diversity as far as language is concerned. But let me give you a more than just like a cheerleader's answer. My first work in linguistics was studying the nation of Ghana. And they have something like 180 languages present in their nation, and about 8 national languages, which all have to be taught right, for children in school, and represented in official communication by the government. I mean, every piece of paper you get or sign you might read, things like this have to have translations in all these languages. So you can imagine what official linguistic diversity looks like on just a material level. It's actually quite a commitment by a national government. But it's very important when you think about what communication actually is and does. And so increasing diversity, like having this connection to our identities, it really, as my work advocates for prioritizing individuals as intelligent language users who have fully developed linguistic systems that they can report on and tell us, how language with a capital L is working. Like, in the moment, like right now in real time. Like, what is language doing? Like if we were going to look at it in the same way we think of as like biologists or geologists might look at, like, what are volcanoes doing or what are blue whales doing? If we were going to say, like, what is language doing? We want to be able to look at every bit of it. We want to be able to see everyone's language. We can't crack open a brain and look at it. It's not visible, right? It doesn't fossilize. So we don't get it in the archaeological record. So the only way we get to learn about it is if you use it. Right? You have to use it. You have to write and sing and scream and use your language for it to get out into the world. It's the only way we can ever express ourselves fully, because it's what we've been given to communicate our ideas. And so for me, encouraging that diversity of communication is part of how we encourage our evolution as a species. And so I'm always going to advocate for it. Always.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Wright. And thank you for answering all my questions.
Thank you for your excellent questions for your course. I'm so happy to be part of it.
Thank you.